Good morning and good evening, all. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Today, we have Peter with us. He is four-time Sitecore Technology MVP, and currently he is working as Sitecore Solutions architect at Accenture. Today's topic is, are frameworks or accelerators evil? Should you care about SXA or JSS? Sounds interesting, right? So without further any delay, let's begin the webinar. Please add your questions into chat window and we will discuss on those at the end of the session. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my session about frameworks, libraries, and SDKs. Of course, as this is a Sitecore user group, we will talk about these in the context of Sitecore with SXA and JSS modules and how they belong to this topic. Let's look what I have prepared for you today. I will start with a brief definition of phrases that I will use throughout this session. I will then continue with Sitecore SXA and JSS and their definition, and at the end we will talk about their benefits or drawbacks, right? But first thing first, let me quickly introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Peter Procházka, and I work for Accenture for more than 11 years now. Out of these 8 years, I'm working with Sitecore platform. I have done implementations using ASP.NVC, SXA, JSS. I did also some Sitecore commerce. I also have more than 15 years of experience with ASP.NET Web Forms, MVC. So Microsoft stack is the one that I have chosen. Also, last couple of years, as we have shifted more to JSS, I also shifted my toolset and languages. So instead of using ASP.NET MVC, I'm more using JavaScript and React nowadays. And I'm also architecting and leading Sitecore JSS projects. I'm also spending my spare time with my family, mainly. I'm also doing some running, and I'm blogging a lot and helping also within Sitecore community. This presentation is about libraries, SDKs, and frameworks, whether you should use them, whether they are more useful than holding you back. As we are using Sitecore, we will mainly talk about SXA and JSS, and whether you should use them or not, or in our terms, when and by which conditions are helping and opposite when they are not. Developers use terms like library and frameworks interchangeably lots of times. So let's first understand what these phrases mean and what are the differences. So simply put, a library is a packaged, reusable chunk of code that performs a certain function or set of functions that are closely related. You can insert a library into your application and call it when you need it to implement the function without having to write the code from scratch. Suppose that instead of an application, you are building a house. One of the things that you will need is, for example, a stove, but it will not be very practical, of course, for you if you build it from scratch, even though that you could more or less buy the small pieces and put it together at the end. But I think for us, for lots of people, it would be just much easier just to buy one off the shelf, right? So library, if you think about it, is to an application what the stove is to that house. SDKs, on the other hand, have a wider scope than libraries do. In fact, all SDKs will contain one or more libraries. An SDK is a collection of libraries, APIs, documentation, utilities, and lots of times also some sample code that help you implement certain features without having to do the work from scratch. SDKs vary in scope and function from implementing a feature or set of features, like an analytics SDK, for instance, to building whole applications for a specific platform, as is the case with Sitecore JSS, for example. Going back to our house analogy, If a library is a stove, then an SDK is a whole kitchen, if you think about it that way. While you can go and buy all your kitchen appliances, cabinet and counter separately, it will be a lot easier to buy a full kitchen set, complete with built-in appliances and instructions on how to assemble it. SDKs can be limited in scope, such as in the case with one room, but they can also have a bigger scope of a collection of rooms or even the whole house. Frameworks are in many ways the inverse of libraries and SDKs. They are also a collection of libraries, APIs, utilities, and documentation to solve common programming requirements. So you don't have to do the work yourself. However, they do that by giving you a foundation on top of which you can build your app, rather than giving you the building blocks. While you insert a library into your application and call it from your code to perform certain functions, frameworks require you to insert your code into them, and they call your code at the right moment. In our house analogy, a framework will be exactly that. The house is a framework. It is the collection of beams and posts upon which you build your rooms, completed electrical wiring and plumbing. Having this ready-made structure upon which you can build your house will save you a huge amount of time and effort. Main difference between frameworks and using SDKs or libraries is the inversion of control. The diagram shows that when an application code uses a library, the developer writing the code is in charge of the application flow. This means that the developer decides when to call the library. However, when we use a framework, the framework decides when to call the library. This shift in control of calling the library from the application code to the framework is the inversion of control at the end. So to summarize, a framework enables a coding environment that contains low-level libraries to address conventional coding issues. The objective of a framework is to deliver faster development of an application. This includes everything we need to build large-scale applications, such as templates based on best practices. For a web application, JavaScript frameworks provide a skeleton with tools for fast development. Internally, such a framework contains a large collection of libraries that provides the developer with built-in functionalities, which helps to develop an application without extensive coding knowledge. What are some benefits and drawbacks? So for the libraries, definitely libraries provide reusable functions that can be referred to within the code without defining them explicitly. It also eliminates the need for writing code for complex functions, prevents us from having to write code to solve the same problem over and over again. We don't need to copy-paste code from previous projects because we were solving the same problem there. We just more or less add the library to our code and use some functions from there or methods. Also, libraries provide us with the opportunity to pick libraries that we want. So yeah, lots of times, I don't know whether this is a benefit or a drawback, but lots of times for example, in JavaScript, you have lots of libraries that help you do some manipulation with the dates, with numbers, but there are lots of them, and sometimes it's really hard to pick one that best suits your needs. Also, libraries reduce application development costs because there's the code that you don't need to write at the end. Also, libraries encourages programmers to focus on configurable and reusable library development. Also, lots of times libraries are battle tested on production. Lots of people already using those libraries. So lots of, let's say, childish issues are already solved. Lots of times also some security issues have been already raised and fixed. So it's like with your code, like you write something, but you still maintain it. So with the libraries, there's the code that you don't need to maintain. Of course, the problem is that, yeah, as we will talk about that in the drawbacks, as I mentioned, it's sometimes a benefit, sometimes a drawback, that there are too many libraries that do the same. So at the end, it's really hard to pick one for certain use cases. Also, using a library means that our code is tied to that library. So sometimes it's really hard to switch the libraries. So we have the vendor lock-in problem that once we choose one library, we need to use it for the duration of the project, because it's really hard to switch them. Also, yeah, when we are switching them, the code that we are writing down really needs to undergo some major changes in many cases, because libraries are not compatible between them. So you need to run different functions, different methods within those libraries. So yeah. Sometimes developer who maintains the library abandons the project without leaving the source codes. Nowadays, it's not that, let's say, not that usual, because lots of times these projects or libraries have source code on GitHub or some similar repo, and it's not that bad, right? But yeah, it's still once the lead developer leaves the project, it's really hard to, let's say, continue or use the library, because the spirit and also the maintainability of the project decreases significantly. Also, using a library in an unsupported environment needs a wrapper, so yeah, it may impact the performance of the application. Also, sometimes lack of support by the developer of the library, that like some people release a library, it's really like well received within the community, but once you start to create bugs, once you start to add some new requirements that you would like to add to that library, like there is nobody to do that, right? So yeah, also lots of times you have some incompatibility issues, and if there is a not new version released often, then you have significant impact also on your application. Using several libraries might impact also the performance, because yeah, in the first load, all of the JavaScript files, for example, needs to load, and yeah, so it might be also a performance concern. Also, sometimes libraries are vulnerable to malicious attacks. Usually, these are addressed within the bug fixes, within the new versions. But as I mentioned, if the developer or the people who are maintaining that library are not that well maintaining the library, it can have these kind of problems. Also, new features that are coming in the future, like you don't know where the library will be in 1 year, 2 years, right? So it's really hard to predict whether if the chosen library that you have chosen is the right one also for the future. But yeah, usually you are doing the best decision at the time that you are doing it, right? So is the best choice that you could do. Regarding the libraries, so yeah, some examples in the JavaScript world, we know jQuery, definitely. That's the JavaScript library that lots of people were using when they started to do the development. It was the only basically library at the beginning because JavaScript had some issues between the compatibility of the browsers, and handling dates in the JavaScript is a bit strange sometimes, that lots of methods have different outcomes that you wouldn't expect. So jQuery was solving these, but yeah, it had lots of performance issues. So many more JavaScript libraries arisen. I think the most well-known these days is React, which is a really nice JavaScript library for building user interfaces. We have D3, which is a library to produce some data visualizations. Underscore is the one that you can pick if you are working on some programming task. So it's solving lots of things. You have the Lodash. If you need to work with numbers, arrays, strings, or objects in JavaScript, that's also one of good choices that you could do. And then we have, for example, date FNS or moment.js that you can choose to manipulate with dates. Of course, the moment.js is, let's say, abandoned these days, and it had a completely different approach to working with dates as the date FNS. One is working with mutable objects, one is not. So it's as I mentioned, if you are choosing the library, you need to choose the one that is best suited for your project, that maybe your developers are already using it, so they are already used to it. So there are lots of, let's say, points of choice that you need to think about, and choose the right one. Regarding frameworks, there are several benefits of using the frameworks in general. Basically, you need to think about that the frameworks are helping you to write less code, of course, because as I mentioned, like frameworks give you some kind of foundation. So it's something similar. You can think about a framework as a sidecar itself, because sidecar itself is giving you lots of APIs, lots of some kind of baseline, some kind of foundation that you don't need to deal with some object relational mapper in your project, because sidecar itself, through its API, can give you access to the databases, right? So you don't need to deal with the database itself. Sidecar is handling that for you. For example, it's giving you some extensibility options, so it's not like that you just pick up the framework and that's it, but you need to customize it, you need to configure it in order to have the most benefit from the frameworks. And of course, it also reduces development costs, definitely. Some drawbacks. Basically, if you are learning how to work with the framework, together with learning the language itself, for example, with C#, you have the .NET or .NET framework. With JavaScript, you have React, you have some, or you have Angular, you have Vue.js, you have lots of other, let's say, frameworks and libraries. And it's really hard if you are learning these to also learn properly the language itself. So that's one of the drawbacks, that you are not understanding properly the in-depth of the language itself, but you basically are learning the framework itself. Yeah, of course, the learning curve. For example, you learn one JavaScript framework or library, then the next project is using another one. Definitely, there is some learning curve because they are using the different approaches, different methodology. So yeah, there is definitely a learning curve. Sometimes the problem with the framework is that what you have in the package can be extended, but lots of things is, let's say, set, so you cannot change it to your needs. It's, let's say, not so easy to do those changes. So you need to, more or less with your choice, you need to think about also this for the future. But like you are fine with what the framework is giving you now, and in the future you want to change it, then you should pick it up. But if you are planning to do some changes or modifications, you should also pick the framework that is suiting these needs. And the last one is the choosing the right one. Yeah, of course, like there are lots of frameworks. You have lots of, they have lots of features. They don't have, like some of the features are only in certain frameworks. So yeah, it's sometimes hard to do. It's hard to predicate what the frameworks will look like in the future. But yeah, you need to do it usually at the beginning of the project. You need to choose one and you need to stick with it, because changing them, yeah, as I mentioned, changing libraries, changing frameworks is cost effective, or not so cost effective, I would say, process, right? So yeah, you will spend lots of time and also lots of money to change these. So some framework examples. Yeah, we have .NET, of course, or the C# and Visual Basic and other languages from Microsoft. That is that you can use methods from. It's giving you some foundation of the features. Part of it is also ASP.NET, where you can build web applications. You have Laravel for PHP, you have Vue.js, you have Next.js, which is like a framework on top of the React library. You have Angular, you have Bootstrap, you have Ember.js. So there are lots of frameworks. There is also a funny meme about JavaScript, that there is no day that a new library or a new framework is not created. So yeah, each day there are new things popping up, new frameworks. So it's really hard to sometimes follow everything. As we are Sitecore user group, we have talked about the libraries, SDKs, what are the differences with the frameworks. So let's take a look what SXA and JSS, or how they belong to this topic. So Sitecore SXA is a great framework for development using Sitecore MVC approach that helps you speed up development process, content creation, overall experience of a content editor with Sitecore platform. As the definition of framework said, SXA is bringing foundation on top of a language which is using in case it is on top of Sitecore. It's also a great example of how to implement Helix principles in a real project. So basically, if you think about it, you have ASP.NET, which is like a framework on top of C#. You have Sitecore, which is again something on top, which is again giving you some foundation. And SXA is going further even, and is giving you more and more functionalities than the Sitecore out of the box. And you can use it to develop Sitecore MVC projects. So if you think about it, if you were doing some Sitecore MVC before, SXA is just helping you make a, let's say, next step in this development and make things much simplified. So let's take a look what kind of benefits it can bring you. Lots of times when you are building Sitecore projects for various clients, we are always hearing, we need multi-brand, multi-site, multi-language, multi-whatever, multi-tenancy sites, right? Lots of times we were creating templates for the insert options, branch templates, and so on and so forth. With SXA, you don't need to care about that. It's like an integral part of SXA. It has lots of templates. It has also PowerShell scripts to provision new sites, new tenants. You have also possibility to create modules, which is some kind of functionality of SXA, where you can group together the renderings, also some functionality underneath, data sources, and so forth. So with this, you can create for your site, you can add a new modules. So really nice features of SXA. What I also liked about SXA is the page and partial design and rendering variants functionality. Where more or less with the page design, you know, like with Sitecore, you usually use standard values on templates to put renderings as some kind of default renderings for that page template. With this page and partial designs, you are giving the opportunity for content editors to create the page designs and partial designs. Basically, they can compose pages with these functionalities without the need of developer to do the changes or to prepare these. Basically, they can prepare page designs and partial designs. They can put their components, and then when you are creating a new page using that page design, it will have already all the components, which is really nice feature. With the rendering variants, for example, you can also put or you can enable content editors to add like HTML or the output or outcome of the components. They can change it based on their needs. So if they have some certain requirements, you don't need to hard code, let's say the HTML, which is generated in some CS HTML files, but it will be more or less done on Sitecore side. Then you have a toolbox, which was my all-time favorite feature of SXA, that you have on the right side of your screen. You will see this in the experience editor, and you can just drag and drop to placeholders, components that you can see grouped by some sections, like under page content, you have pagination, promo component, rich text. So with SXA, you have all of these components out of the box, and what you just need to do is the styling of the components, and then create your own components, which are more like a business critical, I would say. So lots of times we were creating ourselves accordions, carousels, and these kind of components. This is part of SXA. So in theory, if you have, let's say, simplistic site, or if you are creating some brochure sites, it's really just easy for content editors that they will just take what is in SXA, put the components on their pages, change the content, and then the front-end developers will do the magic and style the components as per needs. That's it. And then you are just creating some business critical components. Also, what I liked about SXA is the snippet component, where you can put together a couple of components. And when you are creating a new page, you can put these snippets on the page, and you don't need to compose again the component itself. With this, more or less, you don't need to call developers again. Yeah, we need to have some kind of component which has a header and some rich text field, but they can compose a snippet and they can use it on websites, on the pages. So as we mentioned, SXA is a great example of a framework. Monopose, Sidecore JSS is, I would say, more as a great example of SDK, even though that it's like a thin line, I would say, between the framework and SDK, because JSS has also like a documentation on top of everything. You have also Sidecore headless services that you need to install on top of Sidecore, so something similar as you have with SXA. But in general, I would say it's SDK, because what you do, you install some NPM packages on your machine, then you run some commands, and you can start building your JSS project with a language or with a library that you would like to choose. Then, if we think about it, JSS in terms of React or other frameworks or libraries, you have a vanilla JavaScript, then on top you have the library or framework you choose, and then you have Sidecore JSS, which is on top of each of the library or framework, JavaScript framework. Then, as I mentioned, we have the headless services. This is something that formerly was named Sidecore JavaScript services. It's like a module that provides a suite of REST and GraphQL endpoints that return JSON formatted Sidecore data. And yeah, how it belongs to the whole picture of Sidecore and headless services. So you can pick whether you would like to go, let's say, more front-end way of working, or if you have that kind of team which is more front-end heavy, definitely on top of Sidecore, you will install Sidecore headless services, and you will choose the right track, more or less, with the JSS, where you will pick up one of the libraries or frameworks that it supports, or if you have more backend developers in your team, and the design agency is just providing you HTML and CSS, then maybe going with the ASP.NET Core rendering SDK would be more beneficial for your team. Regarding the support and frameworks, as I mentioned, React is a library that you can pick with the JSS. I would say that's like a really good starting point if you would like to start with JSS, because Next.js, that's like a JavaScript framework, is something on top of React. It's using React at the end as a framework or as a library, right? But Next.js is a framework. It also has lots of features on top of React, so that's why it's, I would say, beneficial to choose Next.js then in the future. and like beneficial at the beginning to choose React. So you are learning React plus JSS plus Sitecore, and then maybe in the future you are switching or moving to Next.js, which shouldn't be that hard from React to Next.js, because at the end it's just React, right? Then you have Angular, you have Vue.js, you have React Native, but that support is only experimentally. I would maybe choose React if you are, let's say, if you have some doubts and if you don't know like which way to go, because yeah, for the future I would say upgrading from React to Next.js is yeah, it should be simple. Regarding the library and framework, I looked into the State of JS website. The URL is on the bottom, and you see that there are some new frameworks or libraries that are arising in the JavaScript world, like Solid, Svelte, Elpan.js, as you can see, Lit, right? But more or less, React is stably around 80–90% of the satisfaction. So that's why it's also a good bet. Also with Vue.js, as you can see, there are similar. There was a really huge interest in the satisfaction with Angular a couple of years back, but from the change of Angular JS version 1, which was version 1, to Angular version 2 and ongoing with, let's say, more faster releases or release cycle, the popularity of Angular went down. So I would say, yeah, React looks like the best bet if you are starting with JSS. Also, based on these usage metrics, React is on top, right, with 80%. Angular and Vue.js are around 50%. So yeah, I would go with React. Some features of Sitecore JSS. It's like the CLI. It's a node-based command line tool. It has also the headless services, as I mentioned. It has also lots of utility functions. It has documentation. It has source code. So it has like everything that you need to start building. And as I mentioned, like the SDK is something that is on top, right? So you have React, but with Sitecore JSS, with one command, it will create a new React project for you. It will give you lots of configurations on top, and it will more or less enable you to connect with Sitecore. So you don't need to do it yourself, which is a plus, because if you think about it, in a couple of minutes, you can have a new project setup that is connected to Sitecore, or even not, because you can work in the disconnected mode at the end. So some topologies that you can use with Sitecore JSS. You can choose between headless and integrated. Headless is, I would say, best for and is also a recommendation from Sitecore on the Sitecore delivery servers, because it's more or less not so performance-wise hitting that much the CD server at the end. So it's not so expensive, because it has just some inexpensive Node.js servers at the end that you are running, and you are just calling Sitecore CD servers to get some JSON out of it from the layout service. But on the other hand, with the integrated mode, you get the power of Sitecore, so you will get the possibility to inline edit the field values and so forth. But also, of course, then the performance is a bit degraded. So yeah, it's hard to choose between these two, because headless, even though that it's recommended by Sitecore, it doesn't have it's not supporting fully all the features of Sitecore. For example, it's not supporting aliases, as we learned on our project. It's also not supporting redirection, for example, out of the box. So lots of things with headless you need to implement yourself if you would like to wish to have them, right? With integrated, you have them, but of course, then you need to tweak around the performance, the scalability of your solution, and so forth. Some benefits and drawbacks. So with Sidecore, SXA, and JSS, and like lots of companies are building their own frameworks and libraries on top of Sidecore, right? Even in our company, in Accenture and also in Evanate, there were lots of these kind of frameworks and libraries that we were using on top of Sidecore. They have some benefits, they have some drawbacks. I think the biggest drawback is that the maintenance and upgradability of these projects is really low, because usually you create these frameworks out of some project or out of a couple of projects. You would like to more or less combine some best practices out of some projects that you did, right? But nobody is then maintaining them, but you are still using them in your new projects, right? So also Sidecore is releasing new projects, so you need to change the DLLs, you need to change the NuGet references, you need to basically fix all of the breaking changes that are there in the code. You need to change, for example, now we are moving from virtual machines to Dockers, right, to Docker containers. So you need to change the approaches. So it's always something new, and it's really hard to, let's say, keep up with these frameworks and libraries. That's why SXA, if you choose SXA and JSS from Sidecore, you have more or less, you don't have these kind of problems, because, for example, SXA has inbuilt upgrade scripts. So if you are, for example, upgrading from Sidecore certain version to new version, then all the content that was there before will be upgraded for you. So that's quite nice. Also, it simplifies many tasks and challenges, as I mentioned, for example, the tenants, sites, setting, management, the toolbox, with JSS. I know one of the projects from the past for my colleagues that they were building something similar to JSS in Vue.js, and it's really hard to keep up with changes in Sidecore versions, and it's also hard to more or less do the wiring between the framework and library. But with JSS, you don't need to care, right? You are just using that framework. Also, you can focus your application development to things that really the business people need, right? With SXA, you have lots of components out of the box, so you really can care only about the components that are crucial for them, that they are not in the package itself, right? So more or less, content editors from day one, in theory, can start creating the content, and you are just creating the components that they miss, right? Some integrations to third-party systems, integrations to them, integrations to some CRM systems, and so forth. Those are the components that we usually build, but we usually build them only after a couple of weeks or months, when we are building the usual content kind of components, right, like carousels and so forth. So with SXA, you have this already, and you can really focus on the integrations itself, or the components that really need the integrations. They are also standardizing the coding practices. Like, as I mentioned, with SXA, it's following the Helix principles. So if you are learning Helix principles, I definitely encourage you to install SXA to see how are the components structured, how is the solution itself structured, because it's a really nice example of Helix principles. And definitely the community, that if you have some problems with SXA, how to implement some things, or with JSS, you can go to Slack or Stack Exchange, and definitely there will be somebody who will help you with your questions. For example, with your company frameworks or libraries, it's sometimes hard to find somebody who will help you, right? Usually you are the one who is debugging the issues, who is some kind of reverse engineering how the components were done. With SXA and JSS, you have like lots of things in the documentation already, so you don't need to figure them out by yourself. Some drawbacks, of course, yeah, learning curve, definitely. Instead of just learning Sitecore, you need to also learn or Sitecore or React or Angular or whatever. You also need to learn the module itself, how it works. For example, with the JSS, you need to learn the commands, how to create the projects, how to create components, right? How to deploy them, how to build them, how to build a solution. But once you learn it, it's like yeah, peanuts, I would say. It's really fast development at the end. Also, the drawback, as we mentioned, you are learning the SDK and framework. You are not learning Sitecore, or you are not working with Sitecore. So the usual issues that you were encountering with Sitecore, you will now encounter, let's say, with SXA and JSS on top, right? So yeah, if you are familiar already with some Sitecore procedures, how to build components with SXA or JSS, it will be a bit differently done. But if you learn it, yeah, you will benefit from it. And then, of course, like always with these kind of libraries, SDKs and frameworks, you have some unnecessary extras. You have lots of features with SXA or JSS that you won't use, right? In certain cases, it will be like a dead code for you, that you have it in the solution, but nobody will touch it. So yeah, maybe there will be some security issues and so forth, but yeah, lots of times there are hotfixes by Sitecore, or you can always ask Sitecore support to give you some hotfix or fix for these kind of things. I would say when to choose SXA, if your team knows well Sitecore MVC development or ASP.NET MVC development, then SXA could be like a good next step. If your team seeks something on top of regular Sitecore MVC development, definitely SXA is a good choice. Maybe if you would like to experiment with the headless services, the ASP.NET Core would be also like a good choice in this case. But of course, then yeah, you won't have the SXA features. Maybe you need to wait for the XM Cloud, what it will bring with SXA and yeah, the headless development. Definitely the time to market. Like I remember one of the projects that we had, that we had to prepare a demo in 2 weeks. So basically, we should take the current website and create it in Sitecore SXA, and we have done it more or less. It was not like I don't know how many pages it had, but more or less without the integration, of course. But the content that they had, we could replicate in 2 weeks. So that's why the client also chose SXA at the end. That basically we could show them that if we bring SXA, you could already have the same website that you have, plus minus, of course, with SXA, and we will just create the integrations that you have for some third-party systems. So that was basically the project then. And yeah, if you have more backend strongly team than front-end skilled, then I would definitely choose SXA in that case. And yeah, the JSS, of course, opposite. If your team is very good in front-end development and they are seeking something to not just use some API from Sitecore like we used to, write the item services and so forth, JSS could be really good thing. Also, it supports the, as I mentioned, in the integrated mode, the inline editing. So you have the field, you can change the fields. We have even implemented edit frames in the JSS. So for example, the icons and this kind of elements on the pages, also content editors can change from the experience editor directly with the edit frames with JSS, which was some kind of really nice feature that we added. So yeah, if you would like to learn headless development, as I mentioned, you have 2 paths, either the JSS or the ASP.NET Core. If you are more front-end developer, then definitely JSS would be the best choice for you. And yeah, of course, if you are building single-page applications, I think JSS is the best choice that you could have. Like we wanted to implement single-page application with SXA and also with standard Sitecore MVC, but yeah, JSS is the best suited for this kind of requirements. And yeah, so if you ask me whether you should use Sitecore, SXA, or JSS, then I would definitely answer that, yeah, go for it. I really liked working with both of them. Even nowadays, I think for the last 2 years or something like that, I'm working with JSS. And even though that as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a really strong background in the backend development with ASP.NET MVC and so forth, like I kind of quickly jumped into the JavaScript train, and I learned lots of things with JavaScript, with React, with JSS itself, and so forth. So more or less, if you find the similarities, then it would be like I think also a good choice. With SXA, for me, it was like a natural from the ASP.NET MVC that I did before with Sitecore. Like SXA was really nice framework that more or less lots of the problems that we were usually trying to solve at the beginning of the project, SXA already has as a functionalities, so you don't need to care about them. You can just use them, and you are more or less just, as I mentioned, creating the components with the integrations or with some specific functionality on terms of the frame or the front end, right? But yeah, I would say, yeah, they have some drawbacks, of course, some nuances, but the learning curve or the learning path that you will have, I think it's much easier than if you are building your own frameworks, if you are trying to reinvent the wheel, if you are trying to create your own methods or functions. So just, yeah, use them, embrace them, and I think that they will be serving you well at the end. So yeah, if you have any questions, then you can always find me on Stack Exchange, Slack, or Twitter. And if you have questions now, then yeah, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, so we have few questions in chat window. So there are few questions from Vignesh. Vignesh, if you would like, I can mute you. So unmute you so you can discuss with Peter.
Peter, thanks for the session.
I cannot hear you well.
So I would like to ask, like currently we have the standalone development, like we are using ASP.NET MVC for our applications in Sitecore 10.1. So will you recommend to migrate to JSS, because we are using SXA? So our application is like highly interactive kind of a thing. So would you recommend?
So you are already using SXA, right? Or Vignesh, I think you have mentioned that you are already using SXA, right?
Yeah, I think he mentioned something like this, but
yeah.
we cannot
So if you are using SXA, I don't know. It's hard to this kind of question it's really hard to answer if you don't see the source code, you don't see the solution itself. I don't know, like in which stage of the project you are, whether you are just starting or you are somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah. It is like a completed application which is running in production currently. So
it is running in production. Okay.
So the thing is, the technology is moving upwards, right? So in that case, we are need to, as a developer, and the technology is moving, right? So in that case, how we migrated from one technology to another
Yeah.
technology.
Maybe one of the questions could be like, is that application like a single page application? Are you using already like a React or something in your project, or which kind of library you are using front end one?
It's currently like full of
because if you are not using, if the application is not single page application, or if you are not using some specific library, JavaScript one, then I would say like, yeah, keep it with SXA. I think, yeah, that could be best for you. I don't know. It's really hard to answer these kind of questions if you don't know the situation on the project. I can see that you have another question: which development model would cost efficiency and cost-effective headless or sidecar standalone? That's maybe a question from somebody from sidecar, I would say. It's also hard to answer because I don't know what are the requirements for example, for the first byte, right? Like the performance requirements that you have. Also, for example, now if you are on SXA with the sidecar standalone development or something like sidecar standalone development, it's hard to do this kind of answers. Sorry that I haven't answered your questions, but yeah, it's too hard to answer them if you don't know the situation. I see also a question from Summit: does sidecar SXA and JSS have full capabilities to create a search page that other third-party module provides, like Coveo and search text? I think SXA has already a search page functionality. Also, there is a search input. You have search results. So there are various components that you can use from SXA. JSS doesn't have that. It has GraphQL queries, and it can put you some results back. But I wouldn't use GraphQL for search in JSS, definitely, because it has some limitations in terms of how you produce the query itself that we also learned on our project. So I would use with JSS, probably I would use either Solar or Coveo or search text, right? With JSS, with SXA, you have some possibilities. Question is whether the out-of-the-box components will, let's say, fulfill the requirements of the search page. So yeah, you just need to try it, and yeah, the client needs to say whether it's okay or not. I see also another question from Vignesh: can you use the Unicorn serialization engine in headless service? Yeah, definitely. We are also using Unicorn with JSS, with our JSS project, so it's not a problem. You can also use the new serialization command tool from Sidecar, from version Sidecar 10. I think there is no problem. For Sidecar Docker, there is a question from Gijo. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly, sorry if not. For Sidecar Docker environment, would you recommend Sidecar SXA with ASP.NET Core or React with Sidecar JSS? With Sidecar Docker, I think both of them should support Docker, so I think it shouldn't be a problem. But with Sidecar SXA, I think you cannot use ASP.NET Core. You are still using ASP.NET MVC. You can use ASP.NET Core with Sidecar headless services. So yeah. Thank you, Vignesh. I see your answer. That yeah, at least high level. Yeah.
I think that's all we have in chat window. Yeah.
And so always I'm happy to help you on Slack or Stack Exchange or anywhere. And like usually it's best if you are not contacting somebody on Slack directly with your questions, but it's good that you are using the channels, of course. And definitely, I would say lots of people already were solving similar issues. So definitely there will be somebody who can help you.
Yes, agree. So I think we are done here. Yeah, so thank you, Peter, for this insightful session. It was very interesting, and we learned a lot. And thank you all for joining. See you in next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.